Have you ever had a belief destroyed? Not shaken, not questioned. Destroyed and dismantled piece by piece, until in the place where there was a solid certainty, only the wind and the vertigo of realizing that you had built your life on something that was never as firm as it seemed remained. If you have, you know that this experience has two phases. The first is panic. The ground disappears. The walls disappear. Everything you used as a reference to know who you were and where you were and what mattered simply stops functioning, and you are left there, suspended in the middle of nowhere, not knowing where to look. The second phase, if you have the courage to cross the first without running to the first certainty that appears to replace the one you lost, is different. It is silence, but not empty silence, full silence. The silence of someone who for the first time can hear what has always been there beneath the noise. Baruch Spinoza lived entirely in the second phase, and what he heard in that silence changed the world. There is a book that the European governments of the 17th century placed on a list called prohibited books. It was not a manual of political sedition. It was not pornography. It was not a treatise teaching techniques of poisoning or instructions for building weapons. It was a book of philosophy, written with the cold and methodical structure of a mathematics book. Definitions, axioms, propositions, demonstrations, about the oldest themes that exist: God, the mind, emotions, freedom, death. The religious authorities read the first pages and understood before finishing that it was more dangerous than any revolutionary pamphlet, because pamphlets ask you to change sides. This book asked something different. It asked you to change your eyes, and once you change your eyes, there is no going back. The book was called Ethics. The author was Baruch Spinoza. And the central idea, but the idea that made the world collapse around him, that cost him family, community, security, acceptance, everything, could fit into a single sentence. God and nature are the same thing. 4 words in the original Latin: Deus sive natura, God or nature, as if they were interchangeable, as if the distinction that every religion had placed between the creator and the creation, the sacred distance between the divine up there and the material down here, was an illusion, a useful fiction perhaps, but a fiction. When you understand what this sentence really means, not the superficial version, not the 2-minute summary, but the full weight of what Spinoza was asserting, you will understand why Einstein, when looking at the equations that described the structure of the universe, responded to a rabbi who asked him about God with just 5 words: I believe in the God of Spinoza. But before we get to the ideas, I need to tell you about the man, because Spinoza was not an academic protected by university walls. He was not a noble with land and title who could afford to think freely because money created enough distance between him and the consequences. He was the son of a merchant, an orphan at 6 years old. He grew up in a community of Sephardic Jews who had fled the Portuguese Inquisition, who carried in their bodies and memories what happens when an empire decides that your faith is wrong and that you have to choose between changing or dying. These people knew the price of thinking differently, and yet Spinoza thought differently, not out of naivety, not because he didn't know the price, but because there was something in him that simply could not function any other way, a kind of allergy to intellectual lies, a physical incapacity, almost physiological, to accept a statement that did not hold up when examined honestly. He was the kind of person who, when someone said, God did this because he wanted, would remain quiet for a second and then ask with that disconcerting calm, but what does it mean to want, for a being who already has everything and knows everything in advance? And when the person responded with a verse, he would fall silent again and ask, who wrote that verse? A human being, right? With a specific language, in a specific culture, at a specific historical moment. How do we know that what he wrote is different from what any other human being wrote when trying to describe the indescribable? Can you imagine the effect that this kind of question had in a room full of people who based their entire identity, their entire survival as a community, on certainties that could not be questioned? The day this exploded was July 27th, 1656. Spinoza was 23 years old. The document of excommunication that was read that night still exists. You can find it in historical archives in Amsterdam. And when you read it, When you read the intensity of the language, the violence of the curses, the determination to erase not just the man but any trace of the contagion he represented, you realize that those religious leaders were afraid, very afraid, not of Spinoza. They could deal with Spinoza with a decree. They were afraid of the questions, because questions, real, honest questions that do not accept because it is written as an answer, are the only thing that a system based on authority cannot control. You can burn books. You cannot burn the human capacity to ask. Spinoza left the synagogue that night, crossed the streets of Amsterdam with the smell of the canal in the air, and the curse still echoing behind him, and went to an empty room. He rented more rooms over the years. He learned to polish glass lenses, the artisanal work that paid his bills and that, ironically, was destroying his lungs while he wrote about eternity. He refused a university chair that would have given him financial security, because reading the conditions of the position and realizing that there would be restrictions on what he could publish was enough for him to decline without hesitation. He refused a pension from a prince. He refused fame. He refused comfort, not out of religious asceticism, not because he thought suffering was noble, because he had understood, and this is one of the most beautiful and difficult things he wrote, that freedom is not having what you want. It is not being a slave to what you want. It is understanding your own desires deeply enough to know which of them are yours and which were placed in you by others, and choosing with open eyes which are worth pursuing. He followed the truth, and he paid the price, and he did not regret it. There is not a single record, not a single letter, not a single line in his writings that suggests regret. In the coming hours, you will enter this world, not from the outside, from the inside. We will start in the streets of Amsterdam in the 17th century, in a community that had survived the impossible and was trying to rebuild what the Inquisition had destroyed. We will understand the boy before understanding the philosopher. We will feel the smell of the environment before entering the ideas, and then we will enter the ideas, what Spinoza meant by God, why this is different from everything any religion has said, why it is also different from simple atheism, why Einstein recognized him in the structure of the cosmos, why Freud recognized him in the structure of the mind, why contemporary neuroscience researchers keep stumbling upon him while studying consciousness, why you, now here with everything you know and everything you doubt, will recognize him somewhere you still cannot name. I will ask you just one thing during this journey. Do not agree, do not disagree, do not judge before understanding. Just listen. With the same quality of attention that Spinoza used when he heard a statement, turning it over, examining it, following each thread to the end before deciding what to do with it. If you can do this for a few hours, what happens on the other side is not my responsibility to describe, because it is different for each person, but I do not know anyone who has reached the end of Spinoza and left the same way they entered. No one. So, Amsterdam, 1632. A boy is born on a narrow street, the child of refugees who carry too much history in their bones. This is where we begin. To understand Baruch Spinoza, you first need to understand the smell of Amsterdam in the winter of 1632. It is not a metaphor. It is literal. The city smelled of salted fish, wet wood, eastern spice, and canal sewage. It was a mixture that the residents had stopped noticing, but that attacked newcomers with an almost physical force. A constant reminder that this city was, above all, a city of commerce. Our city that had been built not on granite or on faith, but on the pragmatic and revolutionary idea that money has no religion, that goods do not. They have a soul, and that a man who knows how to negotiate is more valuable to the community than a man who knows how to pray. This idea, banal to us, explosive for the 17th century, made Amsterdam a unique place in the Western world. While the rest of Europe continued to burn heretics, expel minorities, and build walls between the different versions of the same God, Amsterdam was doing the math. And the math showed that tolerance was good for business, that a city where Jews, Protestants, Catholics, Anabaptists, and Mennonites could coexist without killing each other was a city where trade flowed, where talents from all over converged, where ideas mixed and produced innovation. It was not tolerance by principle, it was tolerance for profit. But it worked. And it was to this city, this improbable experiment of coexistence driven by greed, but that ended up producing something akin to freedom, that hundreds of Jewish families from the Iberian Peninsula arrived over the decades leading up to Spinoza's birth. They had a name. They were called Sephardim from the Hebrew Sepharad, which is what they called Spain, and they carried with them a history that no book can fully convey, because it is the kind of history that is only transmitted through the body. In the reflections, in the instinct to lower one's voice in public, in the habit of not accumulating too many objects because too many objects mean you cannot flee quickly. In 1492, the same year Columbus arrived on the continent that would become known as America. In a historical coincidence that seems invented, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain signed the Alhambra Decree. The decree ordered that all Jews in Spain convert to Catholicism or leave the country within 4 months. Historical estimates speak of 150,000 people forced into exile. Some went to North Africa, some to the Ottoman Empire, some to Italy. Many went to Portugal, a neighbor seemingly more tolerant, where they thought they would be safe. They were not. 5 years later, Portugal forced the mass conversion of all Jews who had entered. They baptized children by force. They separated families. They created the figure of the new Christian, the convert of whom no one truly believed in the conversion, who would continue to be watched, suspected, investigated by the Inquisition for generations. The families that publicly converted and continued to practice Judaism in secret, within their homes, with the windows closed and the doors locked, became known as Marranos, a word that in Portuguese means pig, and which was used as an insult, but which these families transformed over time into something akin to an identity. Baruch Spinoza's family was one of those families. The paternal grandfather, Isaac de Spinoza, had lived in Portugal as a new Christian. The Inquisition had knocked on his door more than once. The pressure was constant. The surveillance, the distrust, the danger of being denounced by a neighbor, a colleague, even a family member who had genuinely converted and looked at relatives with the same suspicion with which the priest looked at them. At some point in the early 17th century, the family decided to leave. They arrived in Amsterdam. They opened a business. They started life anew. And they did something they could only do in a city like that. They became Jews openly again, with a Hebrew name, with a synagogue, with the rituals they had practiced in secret for decades, now performed without fear, with the windows open, with the Sabbath candles lit for anyone to see. Baruch's father, Michael de Spinoza, was a merchant of imported fruits, mainly dried fruits and spices that came from the trade routes that passed through the Mediterranean. He was a respected man in the community. He paid his taxes, fulfilled his community obligations, educated his children according to tradition. Baruch was born in November 1632. The name means blessed in Hebrew. In Portuguese, the translation would be Bento, and indeed in some historical documents he appears as Benedito de Spinoza or Bento de Espinosa. But the world knows him as Baruch, and later, as the Latinized name he would adopt, Benedictus de Spinoza. There were children in the house, an older sister, Miriam, a younger brother, Gabriel, a mother, Hannah, who died when Baruch was 6 years old, from tuberculosis, the disease that at that time claimed lives with the indifference of a wheat harvest. The father remarried Esther, who would also die relatively young, and then again with Rebecca. Death was a familiar presence in Baruch de Spinoza's childhood, as it was for almost everyone in the 17th century, but especially for the children of refugees who carried in their genetic code the memory of the awareness that life is precarious, that what seems solid can disappear overnight, that the only thing no one can take from you is what you carry inside your head. Perhaps this explains something about why he thought what he thought. The heart of the Jewish community in Amsterdam was not the market, although the market was important. It was the Talmud Torah, the school where boys were educated early in the sacred texts, in the Hebrew language, in Jewish law, in the history of the people. Baruch entered the Talmud Torah around the age of 6 or 7. The curriculum was rigorous and followed a clear progression. It began with the Hebrew alphabet and the reading of the Torah. It advanced to the Talmud, with its intricate rabbinical debates on law and ethics. Then medieval Jewish philosophy, Maimonides above all, the great Rambam, who had tried in the 12th century to do what Spinoza would attempt in the 17th, reconcile philosophical reason with religious faith, Aristotle with Moses. The boy was good, very good, not in the sense that he memorized easily, although he did memorize. He was good in the more valuable and rarer sense. He understood. He took a text that the other students deciphered word by word and saw the structure behind the words, the argument behind the story, the question behind the answer. And then he asked another question. The older teachers recognized this type of intelligence. They knew it was a gift. They also knew it was complicated, because a mind that sees the question behind the answer does not stop asking at the convenient moment. It does not respect the invisible line that separates the permitted questions from the dangerous questions. There are records that Baruch was the type of student who made the masters feel a discomfort they could not quite name. It was not insolence. It was something more disconcerting than insolence. It was a quality of attention that made it impossible to respond vaguely. It demanded that each assertion be exactly what it claimed to be, not approximately, not poetically, not in the spirit of the thing, and exactly with precision, with the gentle cruelty of someone who loves the truth more than they love the comfort of those around them. The intellectual context in which Spinoza grew up was richer and more tense than the simple image of a religious community closed in on itself. 17th century Amsterdam was one of the most intellectually vibrant cities in Europe. It was where Descartes had published some of his works, the French philosopher who proposed the idea that reason, not authority, should be the foundation of knowledge. It was where news of the scientific revolution that had begun with Copernicus and passed through Galileo circulated, and which was, at the time of Spinoza's birth, being consolidated by the work of a young Englishman named Isaac Newton. The world was changing, not visibly in the daily lives of ordinary people. The streets of Amsterdam in 1640 did not look much different from the streets of 1580, but in the minds of those who were paying attention, a rupture was happening. A rupture that had to do with a fundamental question: where does knowledge come from? For centuries the answer had been clear. From authority, from scripture, from tradition, from what the elders said, from what the sacred texts affirmed, from what the church or the synagogue or the mosque confirmed. The scientific revolution said otherwise. It said that knowledge comes from observation and reason, that you do not discover how the planets move by reading Aristotle. You discover by looking at the sky, measuring, calculating, and accepting the result even when it contradicts what is written. This idea, seemingly simple, profoundly explosive, was in the air that Baruch Spinoza breathed throughout his education. It was in the books he read beyond the official curriculum. It was in the conversations with men like Franciscus van den Enden, a Latin teacher and free thinker whom Spinoza met in his young adult years and who systematically exposed him to Cartesian thought, Greco-Roman philosophy, and the political ideas that were fermenting throughout Europe. It was also in the texts of heterodox Jewish philosophers that the community knew but preferred not to discuss aloud. Men like Uriel da Costa, who had arrived in Amsterdam decades earlier, full of hope, only to discover that the real Judaism of the synagogue did not correspond to the idealized Judaism he had imagined from years of reading the Bible during his life as a new Christian in Portugal, who had questioned the immortality of the soul and the divine origin of the oral law, who had been excommunicated, publicly humiliated, forced into a degrading retraction before the entire congregation, and who had committed suicide shortly thereafter. The story of Uriel da Costa was known to everyone in the community. It was, among other things, a warning. Baruch heard the warning, and he thought the same way. Spinoza's world was therefore a world of tensions, between the tradition that had formed him and the reason that was beginning to question the foundations of that tradition, between loyalty to the community that had survived persecution and the intellectual honesty that could not pretend that certain questions did not exist, between the love for the texts he had studied since childhood and the growing realization that these texts were human documents, historical, cultural, limited, and not the literal word of an eternal God. There was no way to resolve this tension comfortably. It was a tension that demanded a choice, and Baruch Spinoza, still young, still trying to understand what was forming inside him, still living in his father's house and working in the family business, after Michael de Spinoza fell ill, kept postponing that choice. But questions do not postpone. Questions wait, with the relentless patience of everything that is true. There is a type of thought that you do not choose to have. It simply appears in the middle of a prayer, in the pause between one phrase and another of a sacred text, in the silence after the teacher finishes explaining and asks if there are any doubts, and you feel the doubt forming inside you with the inevitability of a wave that was far away, that you saw coming from afar, that you waited for and that arrived anyway. Baruch Spinoza had this type of thought since he could remember. They were not thoughts of rebellion. He did not have that kind of teenager who wants to shock adults, who questions for the sake of questioning, who finds pleasure in provocation. Spinoza's pleasure was different. It was the pleasure of understanding, of getting to the bottom of something, of not leaving a problem until the problem was completely dismantled, every piece examined, every hidden assumption brought to the surface and evaluated in the light of reason. This pleasure, pure, disinterested, almost physical in its intensity, was the engine. The problem is that when you apply this engine to sacred texts, you arrive at places that sacred texts were not built to go. Let us take, for example, the question of creation. The first verse of the Torah says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Generations of commentators had spent centuries discussing the meaning of each word in that sentence. What does beginning mean? What was God doing before the beginning? Did God create out of nothing, out of what existed before nothing, out of himself? The answers varied, but almost all commentators reached a point where they stopped and said, here is where human reason meets its limit. Creation is a mystery that transcends human understanding. Accept it by faith. Spinoza read these answers with that particular attention that made teachers uncomfortable. And then he asked to himself for now, but why would the limit be precisely here? Who decided that reason goes this far and no further? And was that decision made because there truly is a limit, or because what is on the other side of the limit is inconvenient? Because what is on the other side of the limit when you cross it is a very specific question. If God created the universe, what was there before the universe? And if the answer is nothing, what is nothing? Nothing has no properties, right? It has no dimension, no duration, no structure. How did nothing generate something? How did an absolute absence become a presence? And if the answer is God was there before, then something existed before the universe. Then God exists outside the universe. Then there is God on one side and the universe on the other. But if God is infinite, how can there be something outside of God? The infinite, by definition, cannot have an outside. If it has an outside, it is not infinite. And if God is infinite and the universe exists within God, then the universe is part of God. Then the stone in the path is part of God. The water in the canal is part of God. The thought you are having right now is part of God. The pain, the pleasure, the mistake, the right, all part of God. And if everything is part of God, in what sense did God create anything? A being does not create itself. The waves were not created by the ocean. They are the ocean in motion. So the universe was not created by God. It is God in motion. Deus sive natura, God or nature. This reasoning, which Spinoza would come to formulate with mathematical precision decades later in the Ethics, did not suddenly arise one enlightening afternoon. It grew over the years, question by question, bricks upon bricks, with the patience of someone who knows they are building something that will last. At the same time that this internal building grew, external life continued. Spinoza's father, Michael, had fallen ill in recent years. The fruit import business was facing difficulties, debts, commercial disputes, the inherent instability of trade, at a time when a storm in the Mediterranean could swallow an entire shipment and ruin months of planning. Baruch took on responsibilities. He was the eldest son. There was a family to support, a business to maintain, obligations to the community that could not be ignored without social consequences. He did all of this, competently, seriously, and in the intervals, in the hours between closing the warehouse and sleep, In the mornings before work began, he read everything that came into his hands: Latin, which he had learned from Van den Enden; Spanish, which was the language of the Sephardic community; Portuguese, which the elders still used among themselves; and the Hebrew of the sacred texts, which had been the first language of his thought. What he read formed layers: Descartes underneath, Maimonides on top, Hobbes on one shelf, Bacon on another, and the Hebrew texts of the tradition, the Torah, the Talmud, the Kabbalah with its mystical speculations about the nature of God, now read with eyes that had been trained by rational philosophy to ask, but what does this mean? Not poetically, not spiritually. What does it mean, in fact? He began to share these questions, cautiously at first, with close friends in conversations that were exploratory, provisional, the kind you have when you are thinking out loud and not necessarily defending a position, with men who frequented similar intellectual circles, who read the same books, who asked the same questions, although they did not always arrive at the same answers. But the questions grew, they became more specific, more consequential, and they began to leak. The questions that leaked were serious. Serious in the sense that they had direct theological consequences that any educated rabbi would immediately recognize. The first was the Torah written by Moses. Or was it written by multiple authors in multiple historical periods and retrospectively attributed to Moses by tradition? This question may seem academic now. In the 17th century, it was explosive, because if the Torah was written by human beings, with their limited perspectives, their cultural biases, their political and social goals, then it is not the literal word of God. It is the word of human beings about God, which is a completely different thing. Spinoza had noticed things in the text that tradition explained in increasingly elaborate ways, but which, for a mind trained in rational analysis, had a simpler explanation. The book of Deuteronomy, which supposedly Moses dictated, describes the death of Moses. How did Moses write about his own death? Tradition said it was prophecy. Spinoza said, or it was written by someone after Moses' death. The second question, is the soul immortal? The Bible, examined carefully, does not clearly state what popular tradition says about the afterlife. The concept of an immortal soul that goes to heaven or hell, this concept has much more of Greek than of Hebrew. Plato had formulated this idea centuries earlier, and it had entered Jewish and Christian theology so gradually that many had forgotten it was not there from the beginning. The third, does God have emotions? Does he have preferences? Does he love one people more than another? Spinoza had arrived by this path at a conclusion that seemed modest, but that overturned centuries of theology. A truly infinite and perfect being cannot have states. It cannot move from a state of love to a state of anger. It cannot be surprised. It cannot be disappointed. It cannot prefer one people or one person over another, because all of this implies that God is reacting to something external to him. And if there is something external to God, God is not infinite. These conclusions were not just heterodox, they were, from the community's point of view, devastating. Because if God did not choose the Jewish people, if the idea of an elected people is a human construction, not a divine decree, then the entire narrative around which this community had organized its survival, had justified its suffering, had found meaning for generations of persecution and death, this narrative loses its foundation. And a community of refugees that survived what it survived based on this narrative cannot simply absorb this kind of questioning and continue as before. In 1654, Spinoza's father died. Baruch was 22 years old. He was left with the debts of the business, with the responsibilities of the family, with the weight of being the eldest son in a complicated situation, and with the questions. That kept coming. That wouldn't go away because life got complicated. There is a letter that the leaders of the synagogue sent to Spinoza during this period, or at least historians believe there were communications of this nature, although the exact document did not survive. The essence was, we know what you are saying, we know what you are thinking, you are young, you are going through a difficult time. If you stop, if you keep these ideas to yourself, if you continue to fulfill your community obligations in public, we can offer support. We can help with the debts. The offer was generous under the circumstances, and it revealed how concerned the leadership was, because when you offer money for someone to stop thinking, it's because you know that the thought is real, that it's not a phase, that it won't go away with time. Spinoza refused, not with drama, not with a grand speech about freedom of thought. He simply refused, and he moved on. The community had instruments. It had the cherem, the excommunication. It had been used before, with Uriel da Costa, who had recanted and then committed suicide, with others to lesser degrees of severity, and there was the social pressure that in a small and cohesive community like that was practically total. You couldn't do business with someone who had been warned by the leadership. You couldn't invite him for Shabbat. You couldn't marry your daughter to him. You couldn't buy his products or sell yours. In a big city, you could ignore the community and survive in other circles. But for the Jews of Amsterdam, the community was the safety net, the healthcare system, the bank, the school, the court, the social club. Leaving it was not just a religious matter, it was a matter of practical survival. Spinoza knew all this, and yet. The summer of 1656 arrived with the humid heat that the canals of Amsterdam turned into an almost palpable smell, a mixture of stagnant water and life and decay that made the July days peculiarly intense. At some point during those weeks, the leadership of the community made a decision. We do not know exactly what precipitated it. Perhaps a conversation that went too far. Perhaps a text that circulated among more people than it should have. Perhaps simply the accumulation, the feeling that the situation had gone beyond the point where a warning or an offer could contain it. The decision was for the most extreme measure available, the complete cherem, total, with no defined end date. They set the date, July 27, 1656. The Amstelkerk synagogue was located in a simple building that the community had adapted for its uses, because Jews in Amsterdam, although tolerated, could not build synagogues that looked like synagogues on the main streets. Worship took place in large houses, in converted warehouses, in spaces that from the outside looked like ordinary residences, and inside carried all the dignity and weight of a millennia-old tradition. On the night of July 27th, the candles were lit. There was a protocol for the complete cherem, a precise ritual accumulated over centuries of use, that combined legal elements with dramatic elements in a mixture that was, when executed in its entirety, extraordinarily powerful from a psychological point of view. The candles were lit, a specific number, arranged in a specific way. The shofar, the ram's horn, would be blown at certain moments. The elders positioned themselves determinedly, and the document would be read aloud in Hebrew, so that each word would reach every person present. The text of Spinoza's cherem survived. It is archived in Amsterdam. Anyone can read it today. It begins with a standard formula, with the judgment of the angels and with the decree of the saints. And then comes what is not standard, because even compared to other excommunication documents of the time, Spinoza's cherem stands out for one thing: the intensity of the language, the multiplicity of curses, the determination to cover every possible aspect of human life with the shadow of expulsion. We curse, expel, execrate, and damn Baruch Spinoza. May he be cursed by day and cursed by night, cursed when he lies down and cursed when he rises, cursed when he goes out and cursed when he comes in. The Lord will never forgive him. The wrath and fury of the Lord will be kindled against this man and bring upon him all the curses written in the book of the law. The Lord will blot out his name from under heaven. And it continues. Page after page of curses that cover every dimension of human existence. It ordered that no one speak to Spinoza, that no one come within 4 cubits of him, that no one read what he had written or might write, that no one stay under the same roof as him. It was the equivalent of erasing a person, of declaring him non-existent for all practical purposes of community life. What Spinoza felt that night, we do not know. There is no diary. There is no letter close enough to that moment to capture the internal state of the 23-year-old man who heard those words. What we have are inferences, fragments, and the behavior that followed, which is always the most honest mirror of a person's internal state. What he did not do is revealing. He did not appeal. There was no formal mechanism for appealing a cherem under those circumstances, but there was precedent for negotiation, for communication, for letters sent through intermediaries explaining misunderstandings or expressing regret. Spinoza did not send those letters. He did not retract. He did not send representatives to negotiate. He did not seek a compromise formulation that would allow him to remain within the community while quietly holding his beliefs. He walked out the door and went to live his life. This behavior, this refusal to bend at that specific moment in the face of that specific pressure, says more about Baruch Spinoza than any subsequent philosophical analysis. It says that he had reached, before the age of 23, a clarity about what he was and what he was not willing to sacrifice. It was not stubbornness, it was deeply rational, because the alternative was a life of dissimulation, a life in which real thought existed in an internal chamber, hidden, and external behavior was a performance disconnected from thought. And Spinoza, who was building a philosophy based entirely on the coherence between what a thing is and how that thing manifests, simply could not live like that. It was a matter of integrity in the most literal sense, integrity as the opposite of fragmentation. As the condition of being whole, the months that followed are the least documented of Spinoza's biography. We know that he left Amsterdam for a period, perhaps to Leiden, perhaps to other cities in the region. The debts of the family business had been formally recognized, but not completely settled. There are legal records from this period showing Spinoza navigating practical issues with that same methodical calm that would characterize his entire life. There was no documented emotional collapse. There was no expressed bitterness. There was, and this is the most surprising, no public attack on the community that had expelled him. In all of Spinoza's written work, which is extensive and touches on practically every aspect of human thought, there is criticism of institutionalized religions. There is analysis of the psychology of dogmatism. There is a rigorous deconstruction of the idea of divine revelation. But there is no personal resentment towards his community of origin. There is no anger from the exiled who wants revenge. There is, instead, understanding. Spinoza understood why they had done what they did. He did not agree, but he understood. And this ability, the ability to understand that with which you disagree, to see the internal logic of a position even when you consider it wrong, to not confuse the position with the person who holds it, this ability is one of the most consistent and admirable traits of his entire life and work. It was during this period, in the months and years immediately following the excommunication, that Spinoza began to write systematically. Not the grand project yet. The ethics would take 20 years to complete. But smaller exploratory texts that circulated among trusted friends in handwritten copies. A brief treatise on God, the human mind, and human well-being. Commentaries on Descartes. Correspondence with philosophers and scientists across Europe, who had discovered him through informal networks of intellectuals that existed in that century as salons existed in the next. Spaces for free conversation where the ideas prohibited in official publications could be discussed among people who trusted each other. The reputation anything outside of it. God was not just a creator who stood apart from creation. God was the very essence of existence itself. This radical redefinition of God challenged the very foundations of religious thought, which relied on a clear distinction between the creator and the created. Spinoza's view implied that everything, including human beings, was an integral part of the divine substance. This meant that the divine was not something transcendent and separate, but rather immanent in all things. This perspective posed a direct threat to the religious authorities of Spinoza's time, who relied on the traditional understanding of God as a personal being who intervenes in the world. By equating God with nature, Spinoza undermined the notion of a personal God who could answer prayers, perform miracles, or judge human actions. Instead, he presented a vision of a God that was indifferent to human affairs, a God that simply is, without any need for worship or supplication. Spinoza's ideas also had profound implications for ethics and morality. If everything is a mode of the same substance, then our understanding of good and evil must also be re-examined. Morality could no longer be based on divine command or religious doctrine. Instead, it had to be grounded in the nature of reality itself. Spinoza argued that true happiness comes from understanding our place within the larger whole and aligning our desires with the rational order of the universe. This shift from a theocentric to a more naturalistic worldview was revolutionary. It suggested that human beings are not separate from nature, but are part of a larger, interconnected web of existence. This idea would later influence a range of philosophical movements, from Enlightenment rationalism to modern existentialism. In summary, Spinoza's philosophy represents a radical departure from traditional religious thought. By redefining God as synonymous with nature, he challenged the very foundations of belief systems that had dominated Western thought for centuries. His ideas invite us to reconsider our relationship with the divine, the universe, and ourselves, urging us to find meaning and purpose within the natural order rather than through external religious authority. This profound shift in perspective continues to resonate today, as we grapple with the implications of a universe that is both material and imbued with meaning, space for nothing else. And there was the problem, because if God is everything, if every stone, every animal, every human being, every thought is an expression of God, then no part of creation can be closer to God than another. No people can be God's chosen. Because God does not choose, God simply is. No text can be the word of God in a privileged way, because every word, every human thought, is equally an expression of God within the system. No miracle is possible, because a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature, and the laws of nature are the laws of God, and God does not violate his own laws. The universe operates according to absolute necessity, and what seems like a miracle is simply something we do not yet understand. No special revelation is possible, because God does not speak to specific people at specific times, transmitting messages that others have not heard. The voice of God is the structure of the entire universe, available to anyone who has eyes, reason, to read. No divine intervention in human history is possible, because intervention implies that God acts from outside upon the universe, like a player moving the pieces. In Spinoza's system, God is not outside the universe. It is the universe. The pieces are God. The board is God. The entire game is God. For institutionalized religions, Judaism, Catholicism, Protestantism, this view was not only wrong, it was the end. Because what gives authority to a religious institution is precisely the idea that God communicates in a privileged way through specific channels, specific texts, specific prophets, specific rituals, specific clerics, and that the institution is the guardian of these channels. If God is everything and is in everything and expresses himself equally in everything, there is no privileged channel. There is no guardian. The institution loses its reason for being, hence the violence of the reaction, hence the burned books, the decrees of prohibition, the Sheraman and the episcopal edicts, and the lists of prohibited books. It was not persecution of an abstract idea. It was self-preservation of power systems that understood with instinctive precision that Spinoza had placed a bomb at the foundation upon which they were built. After everything disappears, what remains? Not in the dramatic sense. I'm not talking about catastrophe or sudden collapse. I'm talking about the kind of disappearance that happens when you choose to walk away from everything that was your life. When you walk through a door and the door closes behind you, and you know, because you are that kind of person, that you will not return. What remains is the essential, and the essential for Baruch Spinoza was surprisingly simple. A room, a table, books, paper, a quill, enough light to write, and the freedom to think what he wanted to think. Spinoza moved several times in the years following his excommunication, first to the outskirts of Amsterdam, then to Rijnsburg, a small town near Leiden where there was a community of Mennonites, dissident Christians who practiced a form of religious tolerance that at that time was extraordinarily rare, then to Voorburg, near The Hague, and finally to The Hague, where he would live until he died. Each place was modest, rented rooms in family homes that welcomed him with a mix of curiosity and respect. There was no luxury, no special comfort. There was the necessary as a bed, a table, access to a kitchen, and the silent understanding of the homeowners that their guest needed quiet to work. The work that paid the bills was polishing glass lenses. The art of optics was in full swing in the 17th century. Telescopes and microscopes were relatively new instruments. Galileo had pointed a telescope at the sky decades earlier and discovered the moons of Jupiter, overturning centuries of certainty about the structure of the cosmos. Leeuwenhoek, a contemporary of Spinoza in The Hague, was using microscopes to discover microorganisms, creatures invisible to the naked eye that existed in teeth, in puddles in human blood itself. The lenses that made all this possible had to be polished by hand, with a patience and precision that required considerable skill. Spinoza learned this craft from Van den Enden or from artisans in Amsterdam and developed a reputation for excellence that went beyond philosophical circles. There are letters from scientists requesting lenses from Spinoza. There are records that Leibniz, the great German philosopher and mathematician, when he visited The Hague to personally meet the man he had read about with growing astonishment, found him in his room with a lens in hand. The irony is too visible not to mention. The man who spent his life trying to see more clearly than anyone before him paid his bills, making instruments for others to see better. But it was not bitter irony. Spinoza chose this work consciously. There were other options, and he explicitly refused them. In 1673, the Elector Palatine Karl Ludwig sent Spinoza, through an intermediary, an invitation to occupy a chair of philosophy at the University of Heidelberg. It was one of the most prestigious academic positions available in Europe: guaranteed salary, public recognition, access to intellectual resources, the possibility of influencing generations of students. The letter from the intermediary, which survived, specified that Spinoza would have the broadest freedom to philosophize, and that the elector hoped he would not abuse this freedom to publicly disturb the established religion. This last sentence was enough. Spinoza replied, courteously, with gratitude for the consideration, but with absolute clarity. He said he was not sure that his freedom to philosophize was sufficiently protected by this formulation, that the limits of what could disturb the established religion would be defined by others, not by him, and that he preferred to remain where he was. The response was elegant, but the decision was simple. Spinoza did not trade freedom for security, under no circumstances, for no price, not because he was ascetic or masochistic, not because he despised comfort, but because he understood, and this is one of the central points of his philosophy, that a specific type of freedom once lost is not recovered. The freedom to think what you really think, without filtering thought by what is permitted, or by what will please those who pay your salary, is the only type of freedom that produces real knowledge. Everything else is performance. And Spinoza had no interest in performance. Spinoza's correspondence was published posthumously and is, in itself, one of the most fascinating documents of the intellectual history of Europe in the 17th century. They are letters exchanged with philosophers, scientists, merchants, theologians, members of the nobility, and common citizens who had read something he had written or had heard of him through the networks of intellectuals that existed at that time. What stands out in these letters is not only the content, although the content is extraordinary, it is the tone. Spinoza responded to everyone, to the student who had read a summary of his ideas and wanted to understand better, to the conservative theologian who wrote to say that he was wrong and that the Bible proved it, to the mathematician who had a technical objection to one of his demonstrations, to the enthusiastic young man who wanted to know if he should give up everything and dedicate himself to philosophy. He responded to everyone with the same quality of attention, without impatience, without the arrogance of the genius who has no time for smaller questions, with a patience that seemed genuine, not performative, not the forced patience of someone controlling themselves, but the natural patience of someone who truly believes that every honest question deserves an honest answer. There is a letter to a young man who asked if he should become a philosopher. Spinoza replied with a disconcerting honesty. He said that philosophy does not bring happiness in the common sense of the word, that it leads to a form of peace that is deeper than conventional happiness, but that is also lonelier, that only those who cannot help but do so should follow this path, because if there is a choice, it is better to choose something else. It was Spinoza describing himself. There was no choice. What he was writing during all those years, while polishing lenses and answering letters and living in rented rooms, was the book, The Ethics. It was not a linear project. It was something that grew in a spiral. He revisited sections, reformulated demonstrations, abandoned arguments that did not hold up and built better ones. The letters show thought in process. You can see, in the exchanges with correspondents, where Spinoza tests ideas before consolidating them, where he perceives an objection he had not considered, where he finds a formulation that works better than the previous one. The method of the ethics, organizing philosophy like geometry, with definitions, axioms, propositions, and demonstrations, was not just a matter of style. It was a philosophical statement in itself. It meant, this is not poetry. It is not metaphor. It is not mystical intuition that you have to accept on faith. It is reasoning. Each step necessarily follows from the previous one. If you accept the definitions and the axioms, the propositions that follow are not opinions. They are consequences. And if you want to reject the conclusions, you have to find the error in the reasoning. You have to show which definition is wrong or which step does not follow from the previous one. It was a challenge. No one accepted it completely. But no one completely refuted it either. And that says it all. Spinoza's life in The Hague in the last years has a quality of quietness that biographers describe with a kind of astonishment. It was not the quietism of someone who has given up. It was the quietude of someone who has arrived somewhere. He had friends, not many, but real. People who came regularly to his room to talk, who corresponded with him, who took care of him when he was ill, who recognized the privilege of being in the presence of an intelligence of that level. The owner of the house where he lived in his last years, Hendrik van der Spik, recorded memories of their time together that reveal a man who laughed, who enjoyed a good conversation, who liked to watch spiders weaving their webs. He used this observation, according to van der Spik, to think about the nature of survival and animal intelligence. There was no bitterness. There are letters from the last years that have a lightness, a satisfied precision, suggesting a man at peace. Not the peace of someone who has everything they want, the peace of someone who understands the difference between what they need and what they do not need, and who has spent their life organizing their existence around that distinction. Spinoza called this beatitudo blessedness, not in the religious sense of heavenly reward, in the philosophical sense of a way of being in the world that is sustainable, that does not depend on external circumstances, that is not shaken by the fluctuations of fortune. It was what he had built, brick by brick, over 30 years of life after his excommunication. His lungs had been giving out over the years. The glass dust, an inevitable result of polishing lenses, which he did without proper protection because proper protection simply did not exist in the 17th century, had caused damage that the medicine of the time could not diagnose precisely, but that doctors recognized by the symptoms: cough, difficulty breathing, the progressive slowness of an organism that is being destroyed from within. At the end of February 1677, Spinoza worsened. Van der Spik went to get him in his room on a Sunday morning. The family had gone to church and found him alive, but clearly close to the end. He died that afternoon. He was 44 years old. On the table, manuscripts, letters, and the book, The Ethics, complete, bound, waiting for what he had requested, to be published, without his name on the cover. The circle of closest friends, the amici that Spinoza had cultivated over the years, ensured that the manuscripts reached Amsterdam, that they were printed, that they circulated. The book appeared at the end of 1677, months after his death, with the title Opera Posthuma, Posthumous Works. The Ethics was there, complete, with the definitions and axioms and propositions and demonstrations that he had built over 20 years in small rooms smelling of polished glass and oil lamps. It was banned the same year, by the Dutch, by the French, by the Germans, by the Church, and it circulated across the continent with the force of things that are forbidden, hidden in luggage. Copied by hand, passed from hand to hand in cities and universities, by people who knew they were holding something too important to let die. Have you ever wondered why mathematics works? Not how it works, not the equations, not the algorithms. Why? For what reason does a series of abstract symbols, manipulated according to rules that a human mind invented, describe with extraordinary precision the behavior of physical reality? Why does 2 plus 2 is 4 on paper, and also when you have 2 apples and add 2 more? Why does Maxwell's equation for electromagnetism, derived in the 19th century by a Scottish mathematician from purely theoretical considerations, describe exactly how electric and magnetic fields behave in nature? Why does the geometry that Euclid formulated in Alexandria 2,300 years ago still perfectly describe the space in which you live and move? This question has a name among philosophers, the problem of the unreasonable applicability of mathematics, and to this day it does not have a completely satisfactory answer. Spinoza had one. Mathematics works because reality and thought are 2 attributes of the same substance. They are the same God, seen from 2 different angles. And when thought, using its own internal tools, logic, deduction, mathematical necessity, arrives at a structure, that structure corresponds to reality because the 2 are the same fundamentally. It is not a simple answer, but it is coherent. And it has a beauty that does not depend on faith. That is why Spinoza organized the Ethics as a geometric treatise, not for intellectual exhibitionism, not to seem more rigorous than he was, but because the method was the message. Because if thought and reality are the same, then the rigor of pure thought must correspond to the rigor of reality. And the purest form of rigorous thought that humans had developed was Euclidean geometry, where each statement necessarily follows from definitions and axioms, leaving no room for the vague, the approximate, the more or less. The Ethics has 5 parts. The first is called De Deo, on God. It begins with 8 definitions. The first, by cause of itself. I understand that which essence involves existence, or that which nature cannot be conceived except as existing. In more direct language, cause of itself is something that exists necessarily, that cannot not exist, whose very concept implies existence. This seems abstract until you realize what Spinoza is doing. He is establishing right at the beginning that there are 2 types of things: those that depend on something else to exist, you, me, the chair, the planet, and the thing that exists by necessity, without depending on anything external. There can only be one thing that exists by itself. If there were 2, each would be a limit to the other. And a limited thing does not exist completely independently. That thing that exists necessarily, that is cause of itself, that is not limited by anything external, is what Spinoza calls God, or nature, the unique and infinite substance. The second definition is about what it means to be finite. And here Spinoza makes an observation that seems technical but is fundamental. Something is finite when it can be limited by another thing of the same nature. A thought is limited by other thoughts. You cannot think 2 things at the same time with equal intensity. A body is limited by other bodies. 2 bodies cannot occupy the same space. But a thought is not limited by a body, nor a body by a thought. They are different natures that do not limit each other. This will be important later. The third definition is about substance. By substance, I understand that which exists in itself and is conceived by itself, or that whose concept does not require the concept of another thing from which it must be formed. Substance is what exists without depending on anything, what you can understand without needing to understand anything else beforehand. The stone you kicked on the sidewalk is not substance in this sense. To understand the stone, you need to understand silicon, calcium carbonate, geological processes, time, pressure. The stone depends on all of this to be what it is. What would true substance be? What would exist without needing anything external to exist? The fourth definition is about attribute. By attribute, I understand that which the intellect perceives as constituting the essence of substance. Attribute is how substance appears to a mind that perceives it. It is the angle from which a finite mind sees infinite substance. We, human beings, perceive substance through 2 attributes, thought and extension. We think, and we can perceive thought. We have bodies that occupy space and we can perceive extension. But substance has infinite attributes, infinite ways of being, of which we perceive only two because we are finite. The fifth definition is about mode. By mode, I understand the affections of a substance, or that which exists in another thing through which it is also conceived. Mode is what exists not by itself, but as an expression of something else. The wave is a mode of the ocean. The specific thought you are having right now is a mode of the attribute thought of substance. Your body is a mode of the attribute extension of substance. You are a mode of God or nature, not a separate creature, a mode, a form of expression. From the definitions, Spinoza moves on to the axioms. Axioms are statements that he considers self-evidently true, that any rational mind, upon consideration, will recognize as true without the need for proof. The first axiom, everything that exists, exists in itself or in another thing. In itself, as substance, or in another thing, as mode. There is no third option. The second axiom, that which cannot be conceived through another thing must be conceived by itself. If you need to understand something by reference to something else, that something else is more fundamental. If you arrive at something that is understood without reference to anything external, you have reached the fundamental. And so on. 7 axioms in total, each seemingly simple, but together they build a structure that will support the weight of the entire edifice that comes afterward. From the definitions and axioms, Spinoza derives propositions. 36 propositions just in the first part of the Ethics about God. Each one with a demonstration that explicitly cites which definitions, axioms, and previous propositions it is using. It's like a chain. You pull one link and all the others come along. Proposition 1 says, substance is prior by nature to its affections. Demonstration. It follows directly from the definitions of substance and mode. Substance exists in itself. Modes exist in substance. What exists in itself is logically prior to what exists in another thing. Proposition 3 says, things that have nothing in common with each other cannot be the cause of one another. This seems obvious but has consequences. If thought and matter are completely different, as Descartes said, then a thought cannot cause a physical movement, and a physical movement cannot cause a thought. Descartes' mind-body problem, put in rigorous terms, generates a contradiction. The only solution is that thought and matter are not fundamentally different. They are two aspects of the same. Proposition 5 is where things get interesting. In the nature of things, there cannot exist two or more substances of the same nature or attribute. Demonstration. If there were two substances with the same attribute, one could be distinguished from the other only by their modes. But modes are affections of substance, not the substance itself. The substance, considered in itself, without the modes, would be indistinguishable from the other. But two indistinguishable things are the same thing. Contradiction. Therefore, for each attribute, there exists only one substance. And since God has all attributes, by definition, God is absolutely infinite, which means he has all possible attributes, there exists only one substance. God is the only substance. Everything else is a mode of God. Proposition 11 is the one that makes readers stop and reread. God, or a substance consisting of infinite attributes, each of which expresses an eternal and infinite essence, exists necessarily. God does not exist as you or I exist, contingently, able not to have existed if circumstances were different. God exists necessarily. He cannot not exist. The essence of God involves existence, exactly as in the first definition. And here Spinoza offers several parallel demonstrations of the same proposition, as if he wanted to show that no matter from what angle you approach it, the conclusion is the same. One of the demonstrations, for anything that exists, there is a reason for it to exist. And for anything that does not exist, there is also a reason for it not to exist. The reason can be internal or external. In the case of God, of the infinite substance, there can be no external reason, because there is nothing external to God. Therefore, if God does not exist, the reason must be internal, a contradiction in the nature of God. But the nature of God is consistent by definition. It is infinite and has no gaps. Therefore, there is no reason for God not to exist. Therefore, God exists. The demonstration is not simple at first glance, but when you follow it slowly, step by step, something happens, a kind of fitting, the feeling that the arguments close in on themselves with a precision that leaves no escape. But what does this logical structure have to do with the real world? Everything. Because if God is the only substance, and everything that exists is modes of that substance, then physics, the science that studies how bodies behave in space, is the study of how the modes of the attribute extension function, and psychology, the science that studies how the mind works, is the study of how the modes of the attribute thought function. And both study the same reality, from different angles with different vocabularies. What physics discovers about the universe corresponds to what psychology discovers about the mind, not by coincidence, but by necessity, because they are two angles on the same thing. Einstein intuited this when he spoke of a unified theory of everything, when he sought an equation that would describe all physical phenomena in a common language. He did not get there. But the intuition that there should be one, that the diversity of physical phenomena must have an underlying unity, was exactly Spinozist. They were the same premonition, expressed in vocabularies from 3 different centuries. The second part of the ethics is called On the Nature and Origin of the Mind. It is where Spinoza resolves the mind-body problem that Descartes had left open, and he resolves it in a way that anticipates debates that the philosophy of mind and neuroscience still engage in today. The solution begins with Proposition 7 of the second part. The order and connection of ideas is the same as the order and connection of things. This is one of the densest and most fertile phrases in all of Western philosophy. It means the sequence by which thoughts connect in the mind corresponds to the sequence by which things connect in physical reality. Not because one causes the other, because they are the same thing described in 2 vocabularies. The idea of a triangle and the physical triangle do not have a cause and effect relationship. They are the same structure, the same necessary form that substance takes, viewed from the angle of thought and the angle of extension. And here is the most dizzying consequence. The human mind, for Spinoza, is not a mysterious thing separate from the body. It is the idea of the body. It is the way in which the attribute thought expresses exactly the same configuration that the attribute extension expresses as body. Your thought and your body do not interact. They are the same, described in 2 ways. When you feel pain, when a physical object damages your body, this is simultaneously and by the same process a modification of your mind. Not because the body sent a signal to the mind, because body and mind are 2 angles on the same modification of substance. This has a consequence that contemporary neuroscience confirms in ways that Spinoza could not have imagined. Every emotion has a physical correlate. When you feel fear, your heart races, your muscles tense, cortisol floods your bloodstream. When you feel love, other chemicals, other bodily configurations. There is no emotion that does not have a physical equivalent. There is no mental state that does not correspond to a brain state. For contemporary neuroscience, this is an empirical discovery. For Spinoza, it was a necessary deduction from the nature of substance. The neuroscientist Antonio Damasio wrote an entire book about Spinoza and the neuroscience of emotions called Looking for Spinoza. Damasio argues that Spinoza anticipated, 300 years in advance, discoveries that his team reached through decades of research with patients with brain injuries. The idea that emotions and reason are not opposites, that emotions are forms of knowledge, information about the state of the organism and its relationship with the environment, that suppressing emotions is not being rational, it is being blind to a crucial part of reality. All of this is in the ethics. Written in a room in The Hague by a man who polished lenses to pay the rent. Have you ever tried to stop feeling something? Not pretending you don't feel. Not distracting your attention to something else. Really stopping and ordering yourself, don't feel this, and checking if it works. It doesn't work. You can suppress the expression of an emotion. You can keep a neutral face while feeling anger. You can smile while feeling sadness. You can speak calmly about something that causes you panic. But the emotion itself, the thing that happens inside the body, the racing heart, the tension in the stomach, the color rising to the face, that does not obey orders. Every great philosophical and religious tradition in human history has had to deal with this basic fact, and most of them have come to versions of the same conclusion: emotions are the enemy of reason. They are animal forces that drag the human being down, to instinct, to behavior that the higher mind should control. Virtue consists of disciplining emotions, subjugating them, not being governed by them. The Greek Stoics were the champions of this view. Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca all preached with variations the same thing. You cannot control what happens around you, but you can control how you react. And the right reaction is impassibility, the state in which emotions do not move you, in which you observe suffering and joy with the equanimity of stone. Christianity had its own version, the passions of the flesh versus the purity of the spirit. Emotions, especially those related to the body, to pleasure, to desire, were suspect. They were the vehicle by what sin entered. And the philosophical tradition that came from Plato saw emotions as something even more specific, a disturbance, a noise that interfered with the pure signal of reason. The philosopher's task was to filter out this noise. Spinoza disagreed with all of this, with a radicality that, once again, would only become fully understandable 3 centuries later, when neuroscience began to confirm what he had deduced from his armchair. For Spinoza, emotions, he called them affects, are not disturbances of reason. They are forces of nature. They are necessary expressions of substance just as much as gravity, as much as the movement of planets, as much as any other physical law. They happen because they have to happen. They follow laws as precise and necessary as the laws that govern physical bodies. And this has enormous consequences. The first consequence: trying not to feel an emotion is as absurd as trying not to fall when you trip. Gravity is a force, emotion is a force. You can understand gravity, you can work with it, you can build structures that take it into account, but you cannot simply decide that it does not exist and walk in the air. Similarly, you can understand emotions, you can work with them, you can build a life that takes them into account. But trying to eliminate them is to battle against your own nature, and those who battle against their own nature lose, always, because nature is stronger. The second consequence: what we call vices and moral virtues are not violations or obediences to external divine laws. They are simply forces that increase or decrease our capacity to exist. Spinoza introduces a concept that is central to all his philosophy: conatus. Conatus is the effort of each thing to persevere in its being, to continue existing, to maintain and expand its own capacity to be what it is. A stone has conatus. It tends to remain in motion or at rest, unless an external force changes it. A living organism has conatus. It seeks nourishment, avoids predators, reproduces. A human being has conatus, but human conatus includes mental dimensions that go far beyond physical survival. And the effects, the emotions, are precisely the variations in conatus. They are the way substance through us registers whether we are expanding or contracting, whether we are becoming more fully what we are or less. The emotions that increase conatus, that expand our capacity to exist, to think, to act, Spinoza calls joy, in a broad sense. Laetitia. Those that decrease conatus, that contract our capacity, he calls sadness, tristitia, and those that orient us towards something we believe increases our conatus, whether they are objects, people, states, he calls desire. Cupiditas, joy, sadness, desire. These are the 3 primitive affects. All other human emotions, love, hate, envy, compassion, hope, fear, gratitude, regret, are combinations and variations of these 3. Love, for example, is joy accompanied by the idea of an external cause. When something expands us, and we attribute that expansion to a person or thing, we call what we feel love. Hate is sadness, accompanied by the idea of an external cause. When something contracts us and we attribute that contraction to someone, we call what we feel hate. Envy is sadness at another's joy, because we perceive that another's expansion diminishes, we imagine, our own relative expansion. Compassion is sadness at another's sadness, because human beings are naturally imitative in emotions. The suffering we observe tends to resonate within us. This cataloguing of emotions occupies a significant part of the ethics, and it is one of the most fascinating, because Spinoza descends from level to level, deriving each emotion from the previous ones with that same geometric meticulousness. The result is something that simultaneously resembles a treatise on philosophy and a manual of psychology, more sophisticated than much of what came afterward. But where does freedom fit into this story? If emotions are forces of nature, if conatus is a law that governs us just as gravity governs bodies, if we are modes of a substance that operates according to absolute necessity, where is the space for human freedom? This is the question that many readers of Spinoza approach with anxiety, and his answer is one of the most original, counterintuitive, and enduring in the history of philosophy. Freedom is not the absence of causes. It is not the ability to act without being determined by anything. That ability does not exist, neither for humans nor for God. Everything that happens has a cause, everything. This may seem like fatalism, but it is not, because Spinoza distinguishes between two types of determination. The first type, being determined by external causes that you do not understand. You feel anger without knowing exactly why. You act on impulse. You follow a desire without examining where it came from. You are driven by emotions that are automatic reactions to stimuli without the mediation of understanding. This type of determination Spinoza calls servitude. You are determined by external causes to you, and since you do not understand these causes, you have no way to work with them. It is a boat without a rudder in a stormy sea. It goes where the wind blows. The second type, being determined by your own nature, understood. You understand why you feel what you feel. You understand where the desire comes from. You understand the emotion as information about your relationship with the world, not as an irrational storm to be suppressed, but as data to be understood and integrated into action. This type of determination Spinoza calls freedom. It is not the freedom to escape necessity. It is the freedom to be determined by the necessity that is your own nature, and not by external causes that you do not control. The clearest example is fear. You see a snake on a path. Your heart races, your muscles tense. You recoil and automatically before you think. This is fear as an automatic reaction to an external cause. You did not choose to feel fear. Fear happened. There are two ways to deal with this. The first, the way of servitude, is to be completely governed by that fear. Not being able to move forward, not being able to think clearly, being swept away by emotion like a boat by the wind. The second, the form of Spinoza's freedom, is not to suppress fear. It is to understand it. It is to recognize that fear is information, information about real or perceived danger. It is to examine, is this snake poisonous? Am I really in danger? Or is my nervous system reacting to a stimulus without discriminating between real threat and imagined threat? When you understand fear for what it is, an automatic response of the organism to a stimulus perceived as a threat, you gain the ability to work with it, not to eliminate it, to use it as information, to integrate it into action, to be determined not only by the automatic reflex but by the understanding that frames it. This, for Spinoza, is freedom, and it is achievable. Not perfectly. No finite human achieves perfect freedom, because there are always external causes that we do not fully understand, but as an ideal towards which one can progress. The more you understand, the more you comprehend your own nature, the causes of your emotions, the laws that govern your functioning as a being in the world, the closer you get to being determined by your own nature and not by external forces that sweep you away like winds you cannot see. Freud arrived at some of these conclusions through a completely different path. Decades of clinical work with patients analyzed dreams, mapped resistances, gradually revealed structures of the unconscious. What Freud called the unconscious, forces that determine our behavior without our knowing, Spinoza called external causes not understood. What Freud called therapeutic insight, the moment when the patient understands a connection that was previously opaque, Spinoza would call progress towards freedom. Psychoanalysis and Spinoza's philosophy reached similar conclusions about human psychology through radically different methods. This convergence between 17th century philosophy and 20th century clinical practice is not a coincidence. It is the same phenomenon observed from different angles, like thought and extension in the ethics, the same reality, two vocabularies. At some point this night, perhaps while you sleep, perhaps while you dream, billions of cells in your body will die. It is not drama, it is physiology, it is metabolism at work, the organism renewing itself, life maintaining its own structure through a continuous process of destruction and reconstruction that never stops while you are alive. You tomorrow are not exactly you today. Most of the cells that make up your liver now did not exist 2 years ago. The atoms that make up your bones are replaced over decades. In some literal and verifiable sense, you are a process, not a static thing, but a pattern that persists while the elements that compose it flow and change. And one day that pattern dissolves. This is the question that all religions were created to answer, that all philosophy at some point has to confront, that every human being who thinks with some depth eventually faces, in that unusual moment of silence that life grants from time to time, and needs to decide what to do with it. What happens next? Spinoza had an answer. It was not the answer that religions provided. It was not the answer that common sense would expect from someone who had thought about death with the seriousness that he had. It was an answer that, when you truly understand it, when you follow it to the end, without simplifying it to make it more comfortable, has a strangeness that is both disturbing and strangely comforting. Let's begin with what Spinoza did not believe. He did not believe in personal immortality in the sense that most religions describe it. There is no individual soul that survives the body, that retains its memories and identity, that goes to a specific place after death and eventually reunites with other souls. For Spinoza, this was impossible by the logic of the system he had constructed. If mind and body are two attributes of the same substance, if they are two angles on the same configuration of the modes of God, then the dissolution of the bodily pattern necessarily implies the dissolution of the mental pattern that corresponds to it. You think with a brain. The brain is the idea of the body, the mode of the attribute thought that corresponds to the mode of the attribute extension that is your physical body. When the body dissolves, the pattern of thought that corresponded to that specific body also dissolves. There is no separate soul that flies away to another place. This seems brutal, cold, the darkest conclusion that a materialist mind could draw. But Spinoza did not stop here, because there was a second step in the reasoning, a step that most superficial readings of his thoughts on death fail to see. Proposition 23 of the fifth part of the Ethics states, "The human mind cannot be absolutely destroyed with the body, but something of it remains that is eternal." How? If the individual pattern dissolves with the body, what remains? The answer requires you to return to the fundamental distinction of Spinoza's system, the distinction between what is eternal and what is temporal, between what exists sub specie aeternitatis, under the aspect of eternity, and what exists sub specie durationis, under the aspect of duration, of time. Everything that exists has two aspects, a temporal aspect, its particular existence at a specific moment, with a specific configuration that began at one point and will end at another, and an eternal aspect, its essence, the necessity by which something is what it is, regardless of when it exists or for how long. You, as a particular individual, exist temporally. You were born, you will die. This specific configuration of thoughts and memories and experiences that is you exists in a finite duration, but the essence of what you are, the necessary form that substance takes when it expresses itself as you, does not exist in time. It is in the eternal structure of substance, like the relationship between the sides of a triangle is in the eternal structure of geometry. The specific triangle you drew on a piece of paper will disappear when the paper deteriorates, but the relationship it exemplified, the necessity that the angles of a triangle sum to 180 degrees, does not disappear. It was not on the paper. It was in the structure of geometric space. In the same way, you, as a particular pattern, will disappear. But what you are in essence, your way of being, Your specific manner of existing as a node in the infinite network of substance has an aspect that does not exist in time and therefore does not die with time. This seems like too abstract a consolation to function as an answer to death. And Spinoza knew this. He was not trying to console, he was trying to describe. But there is a practical dimension to this view of death that is not immediately obvious, and that, when you see it, changes the relationship with mortality in a way that goes beyond consolation. Human life, most of the time, is lived under the aspect of duration. You think about the past, what happened, what was lost, what should have been different. You think about the future, what will happen, what you fear, what you hope for. You oscillate between memory and anticipation, between nostalgia and anxiety. The present, the moment when life actually happens, is constantly sacrificed to this oscillation. Spinoza said that the good life, what he called beatitudo, blessedness, is precisely the state in which you can perceive your existence sub specie eternitatis, not as a sequence of moments that are always passing, always being lost, always carrying the shadow of the end, but as the necessary expression of an eternal substance, like the wave that, while it exists, is the ocean. The wave does not suffer from not lasting forever. The wave is the ocean in motion. While it exists completely. And when it ceases to exist as a wave, it continues in the ocean, not as memory, not as a persistent identity, but as the substance it has always been. There is a phrase in the 5th part of the Ethics that readers of Spinoza invariably memorize, not because it is the most rigorous or the most technically precise, but because it is the most honest, the most human, the most strangely beautiful that came out of all that geometric structure. The phrase is, "A free man thinks of nothing less than death, and his wisdom is a meditation not on death, but on life." Do not think of death, think of life, but not as an escape from the awareness of mortality, not as anesthetic distraction, as the recognition that death is not the problem. The problem, the only thing that truly wastes existence, is living in such a way that life is an anticipation of death, instead of a full expression of what you are while you exist. The fear of death, the existential anxiety that permeates so much of human experience, comes for Spinoza from the same source of all human suffering, from servitude, from being governed by external causes that one does not understand, from oscillating between hopes and fears about the future, from building identity on things that are by nature perishable. Freedom, beatitudo, is the state in which you exist in the present. Understand your own nature, act from that understanding, and experience life not as a countdown, but as the expression, while it lasts, of something eternal. Einstein returned to Spinoza at this specific point, not in the equations, not in physics, but when he spoke about what he called the oceanic feeling, the experience, which he described as central to his intellectual and emotional life, of perceiving oneself as part of something immeasurably greater, not God in the personal sense, not a presence that loved him or cared about his particular fate, but the order, the underlying mathematical beauty of every physical phenomenon, the coherence that made the universe intelligible, the necessity that made the equations have to be as they were. When Einstein said he felt humility before the universe, he was not being modest for performance. He was literally describing the experience of perceiving that what he was, a brilliant physicist in a laboratory in Princeton, was a mode of something that went far beyond any individual identity. It was the God of Spinoza, experienced not as a philosophical doctrine but as a lived feeling. What does all this mean for you? I will not answer, not because I am being evasive, because Spinoza himself would be the first to say that imported answers do not work, that the whole point of his philosophy is to offer tools for understanding, not to prescribe conclusions. What I can say is this: if you have listened carefully up to this point, if you have followed the logic of the system, if you have accompanied the man and the ideas and what it cost to build them, then something has changed in the way you perceive the universe around you. Perhaps just a millimeter. But millimeters accumulate. The stone you kick on the sidewalk is no longer just inert matter. It is a mode of God, of the unique substance that exists necessarily and expresses itself in everything that is. The thought you are having right now is not an isolated event in a mind separate from the universe. It is the substance. Knowing yourself through you in this specific moment. And you, with your memories and your fears and your desires and your questions, are not a stranger lost in an indifferent universe. You are the universe for a moment, becoming aware of itself. There is a question that governments throughout time have tried to answer in their favor. How far does the power of the state over the individual go? Can the state dictate what you should eat, whom you should marry, what you should believe, what you can say in public? Can it enter your mind and reorganize it according to the interests of power? In 1670, 6 years before his death, Spinoza published the most dangerous book he had written up to that point, and he published it while alive, a rare thing for him as he preferred anonymity and manuscripts circulating in secret. The book was called Tractatus Theologico-Politicus. It was banned in less than a year, and in it Spinoza stated something that no philosopher had said so clearly before. The state has no power over thought. It never has, it never will. Not because thought is sacred in a religious sense, but because it is impossible. You can force a man to say he believes in something. You cannot force him to believe. You can punish those who express certain ideas. You cannot erase ideas. You can burn books. You cannot burn the human capacity to reach the same conclusions again. The attempt to control thought does not protect the state. It destroys the state. Because a state that fears free thought is a state that has lost confidence in its own reason for existence. Spinoza was the first modern Western philosopher to systematically argue for freedom of expression, not as a generous concession from power, but as a necessary condition for any healthy society. Not because free ideas are always correct, because suppressing them ensures that incorrect ones are never corrected. Truth needs freedom to emerge. In an environment of censorship, what wins is not the truest idea. It is the idea of the most powerful. Spinoza was not naive about power. He had read Machiavelli. He had studied Hobbes. He understood that human beings are not naturally rational, nor naturally cooperative, that fear and desire govern most human actions most of the time. But he also understood that this did not justify despotism. It justified, on the contrary, democracy, not as an abstract ideal, but as a practical arrangement that recognizes human nature as it is. In a democracy, collective decisions pass through the filter of many minds. No individual mind is wise enough, free enough from self-interests, or capable enough of seeing all angles of a problem to be trusted with absolute power. The distribution of power is not a luxury. It is a protection against inevitable human fallibility. This was radical in 1670. Europe was governed by absolutist monarchs who derived their authority from God, or claimed to. Questioning the legitimacy of absolute power was, in many countries, treason. Spinoza questioned it, with the same calm with which he questioned everything. And the ideas he put forth in the Tractatus, about freedom of expression, about the separation of religion and state, about the rational foundation of political authority, would reappear 100 years later in the American and French constitutions. The drafters of those constitutions did not cite Spinoza by name. It would have been too dangerous, but they had read him, and the marks were there. Spinoza did not hate religion. This needs to be stated clearly, because a superficial reading of his story, the excommunicated boy who spent his life fighting faith, is a caricature that betrays the complexity of what he really thought. What Spinoza did with religion was more surgical than hatred. It was an analysis, an X-ray, the attempt to understand where it comes from, what it serves, where it helps, and where it deceives. And the diagnosis was sophisticated. Religion, Spinoza argued, has two layers. The outer layer, rituals, texts, institutions, hierarchies, dogmas, the social and political apparatus that has built up around the religious experience over millennia. This layer is human-made. It did not descend from heaven. It was constructed by people, in specific historical contexts, with objectives that mix the genuine with the convenient. The inner layer, the deep intuition which he called amor intellectualis Dei, intellectual love of God, that we are part of something infinite, that existence has a coherence that transcends the individual, that there is beauty and order in the structure of the universe that deserves something akin to reverence. Spinoza not only respected this inner layer, it was, in a way, the heart of all his philosophy. The problem, the only problem, but it was huge, was when the outer layer claimed to be the inner layer, when the institution claimed to be the sacred, when the text claimed to be the literal word of God, when the ritual claimed to be the privileged access to the divine, because at that moment, the outer layer began to block the inner layer. The institution replaced the experience, authority replaced reason, and the human being, instead of being led to the understanding of the whole of which he is a part, was kept in a relationship of dependence on the structure that claimed to mediate that understanding. Spinoza called this superstition, not with mockery, with clinical sadness. Superstition is not belief in the supernatural. It is the substitution of understanding for obedience. It is accepting an image of God made by humans in specific historical circumstances and treating that image as if it were reality. And the consequences of this substitution were, for Spinoza, tragic, because the image of God that historical religions constructed was, in most cases, the image of an absolute king, a sovereign who chooses favorites, who demands obedience, who punishes disobedience, who intervenes in human history according to preferences that often seem to coincide with the interests of those who interpret his will. This God is useful for those who want to maintain power. He has no necessary relation to the real structure of the universe. Spinoza's proposal was not to destroy religion. It was to purify it, to return the religious experience to what was genuine in it, the awe before the order of the universe, the perception that we are part of something immense, the love that emerges from understanding rather than fearing, and to separate this from the historical apparatus that had accumulated around this experience, and that often suffocated it instead of nurturing it. True religion, for Spinoza, does not require intermediaries. It does not require sacred texts that only the initiated can interpret. It does not require sacrifices, pilgrimages, purification rituals. It requires only understanding. The more you understand the universe, the more reason illuminates the structure of what exists, the closer you come to the intellectual love of God, not because God loves you back, in a personal sense, but because understanding the whole of which you are a part is the only form of freedom that a finite being can achieve. Einstein again. The most beautiful experience we can have is the mysterious. It is the fundamental emotion that stands at the cradle of true art and true science. It was Spinoza, 300 years later, speaking through the mouth of a physicist. There is a historical convention that places the European Enlightenment, that extraordinary intellectual movement of the 18th century that produced the French Encyclopedia, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the separation of church and state, individual rights, science as the foundation of knowledge. There is a convention that places this movement starting with Locke, Voltaire, Montesquieu, Rousseau. These are the names that appear in textbooks, the ones cited in speeches about democracy and freedom. Spinoza rarely appears on that list. But historians who study the period closely know one thing that textbooks hide. Spinoza was there before all of them, and the ideas they made famous had in most cases direct roots in what he had written. Jonathan Israel, one of the greatest historians of the Enlightenment, spent decades documenting what he called radical enlightenment, the deepest and most consequential current of the 18th century, which went beyond moderate reforms and questioned the very foundations of the European religious and political order. And the gravitational center of this radical enlightenment, according to Israel, was Spinoza. Not by direct and openly cited influence. Citing Spinoza was still dangerous, still associated with atheism and subversion, but through the underground circulation of ideas, through manuscripts that passed from hand to hand in private libraries, through conversations in cafes and salons, where the Tractatus and the ethics were discussed by people who would never cite them in public. The separation of religion and state, Spinoza. The idea that political authority derives from the consent of the governed, not from a divine mandate, Spinoza. Freedom of expression as an inalienable right, Spinoza. The historical critique of sacred texts, Spinoza. The fundamental equality among human beings, humans regardless of origin or belief, Spinoza. All of this existed, formulated with precision and defended with rigor, in the books that had been burned 100 years earlier. The flames had not reached the ideas. Voltaire, who was never generous with contemporaries or predecessors, recognized Spinoza with a mixture of admiration and discomfort that is perhaps the most honest praise one can receive from Voltaire. He said that Spinoza had destroyed popular theology with a clarity that no one had achieved before. And he said this as a complaint, because the destruction had been so complete that it made the moderate project of religious reform that Voltaire himself advocated more difficult. Spinoza had gone too far, which is, depending on how you look at it, the same as saying he had come too close to the truth. The Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, the book published in 1670, was the first modern Western text to treat the Bible as a historical document, not as desecration, as method. Spinoza argued that to understand what the Bible means, you have to understand when it was written, by whom, and for what purposes. That a text produced in a specific culture, in a specific language for a specific audience, cannot be read as if it were a context-free message sent by the eternal to the universal. This seems obvious today. In the 17th century, it was declared heresy, and it is the foundation of all modern biblical criticism, the academic field that revolutionized theology in the 19th century universities, that produced the historical studies of Jesus, that separated the historical Jesus from the theological Christ, that mapped the sources of the Pentateuch and the different authors behind the Gospels. All of this begins, methodologically, with Spinoza's Tractatus. The German theologians of the 19th century who built this field rarely mentioned it, but the debt was there, in the method, in the approach, in the willingness to treat the sacred text with the same analytical tools as any other historical document. There is a type of influence that does not appear in footnotes, not the direct citation, as Spinoza said, but the absorption so deep of an idea that it becomes part of the heir's thought structure, that they no longer need to cite because they can no longer distinguish where the other's idea ends and where theirs begins. This type of influence is deeper than citation. It is more enduring. And this is exactly how Spinoza operated in the greatest thinkers of the 2 centuries that followed his death. Hegel said that to begin doing philosophy, it was necessary to first bathe in Spinoza. It was not a vague compliment. It was a precise description of how Hegel's system was constructed. Hegel's central idea that reality is a process of self-development of the spirit, that the universe is a totality that knows itself through history and human thought, is in many respects Spinoza set in motion. Spinoza had said, there is a single substance that expresses itself through infinite modes. Thought and extension are 2 angles on that substance. Hegel took that structure and added time. He added history. He said, the substance is not static, it develops. The spirit unfolds through human history, understanding itself better in each era, toward a total self-consciousness. It was Spinoza with dialectics. Spinoza in motion. Marx read Hegel and did with him what Hegel had done with Spinoza. He took the structure and turned it upside down. Hegel had said that it is the spirit that moves history. Marx said, no, it is matter. It is the material conditions of production, the economic relations, the concrete structure of how human beings produce what they need to survive. But the idea that everything is interconnected, that the individual cannot be understood outside the totality in which it exists, that consciousness is determined by the conditions of existence and not the other way around. This is Spinoza, passing through Hegel, reaching Marx. Spinoza's determinism, the idea that everything happens out of necessity, that there are no coincidences, that what seems free will is misunderstood determinism, reappears in Marxist theory of historical determinism, in the idea that economic forces develop according to necessary laws, independent of individual will. Marx was never a declared Spinozist, but historians of ideas see the legacy on every page. Nietzsche is the most dramatic case. Nietzsche, who shouted, "God is dead," and seemed the opposite of everything Spinoza had built. But when you look closer, the resemblance is unsettling. Spinoza's conatus, the effort of each thing to persevere and expand its being, reappears in Nietzsche as will to power, not the will to dominate others, but the fundamental drive of each living being to expand, create, and surpass itself. Spinoza's critique of the morality of obedience, the idea that virtue is submission to an external law, reappears in Nietzsche as a critique of slave morality, the ethics of resentment that calls impotence virtue. Spinoza's idea that freedom is being determined by one's own nature, not absence of determination, but self-determination understood, reappears in Nietzsche as the ideal of the Übermensch, the being that creates its own values instead of inheriting them. Nietzsche recognized the affinity with Spinoza in a letter from 1881, describing the experience of rereading the ethics as discovering a predecessor, with a mixture of enthusiasm and intellectual jealousy that was very Nietzschean. Freud is the most honest of the four about the debt, not in technical texts, there the references are scarce, but in letters, in conversations, in late statements. Freud acknowledged that the idea that unconscious forces determine conscious behavior, the cornerstone of all psychoanalysis, had deep roots in Spinoza. The analysis of affects in the ethics, the cataloguing of emotions as natural forces that follow precise laws, the idea that not understanding the causes of one's own emotions is the root of psychological servitude, is the psychology of the unconscious before the unconscious had that name. Freud called it the unconscious. Spinoza called it misunderstood external causes. Freud called it therapeutic insight. Spinoza called it progress toward freedom. The method was different. The consulting room versus the philosopher's chair. Dreams and transference and resistance versus definitions and axioms and propositions. But the fundamental discovery was the same. We are driven by more than we know. And understanding what moves us is the only way to stop being swept away by it. God does not play dice. It is the most famous phrase Einstein ever said about God, uttered in response to quantum mechanics, to the discovery that at the subatomic level, nature seems fundamentally probabilistic, that you cannot predict with certainty where a particle will be, only calculate the probability. For Einstein, this was unacceptable. Not for religious reasons in the conventional sense, for Spinozist reasons. If God is the necessary structure of the universe, if the laws of nature are the expression of God's nature, then that structure must be determined, complete, with no gaps where chance enters. Spinoza's universe is a universe where everything happens out of necessity, where what we call chance is simply ignorance of the causes, where, if you knew the position and momentum of every particle in the universe, you could perfectly predict everything that will happen next. Einstein believed in that universe. He spent the last 30 years of his life searching for the unified theory that would describe that universe in one equation, that would show that apparent quantum randomness was the result of our ignorance of hidden variables, not the actual structure of reality. He did not find it. And later experiments, culminating in Bell's experiments in the 1960s and 1970s, suggested that Einstein was wrong. That quantum randomness is not ignorance, it is the nature of the real. This seems a defeat for Spinoza, but the story is more complicated, because what quantum physics revealed, and that Einstein resisted until his death, but that the data confirmed, is not chaos. It is a different order, deeper. Not the order of billiard balls colliding predictably, but the order of probability patterns that manifest with extraordinary mathematical precision. The quantum universe is not random in the sense of arbitrary. It is probabilistic in the sense that it obeys precise mathematical laws that describe not the individual outcome, but the distribution of outcomes. The Schrödinger equation that describes how the wave function evolves over time is as determined, as necessary, as any equation Newton wrote. The order is there. It just operates in a way that classical categories of determinism and causality cannot fully capture. Spinoza, of course, did not. He could have anticipated quantum mechanics. His universe was Aristotelian continuous, classically determined. But the central intuition that there is a necessary order underlying the apparent diversity and apparent contingency of phenomena, this intuition survives quantum physics. It is confirmed by it, in a way that Spinoza could not have predicted, but that might not have surprised him. What modern neuroscience has done with Spinoza is even more direct. Antonio Damasio, a Portuguese neuroscientist who worked for decades with patients with brain injuries, studying how different parts of the brain contribute to emotion, reason, and decision-making, reached conclusions that led him to write an entire book about the relationship between his findings and Spinoza's philosophy. The title of the book is In Search of Spinoza, and the central thesis is this: Spinoza, without access to any of the instruments of modern neuroscience, had described the relationship between mind and body, between emotion and reason, with a precision that 300 years of science have confirmed rather than refuted. The idea that emotions and reason are not opposites, that emotions are forms of embodied knowledge, that reason without emotion does not produce good decisions, this is what Damasio empirically demonstrated with patients who had damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, who had lost the ability to feel emotions, and therefore had also lost the ability to make reasonable decisions. It was the experiment that Spinoza had conducted only with reason 300 years earlier, and he had arrived at the same place. Let's go back to the beginning. A 23-year-old man walks through a synagogue door on a July night in Amsterdam. Curses echo behind him. The family he knew, childhood friends, the only world that existed for him, everything remains on the other side of that door. He walks through the dark streets with the canal reflecting what little light remains. We do not know what he felt, no one knows. What we know is what he did next. He rented a room, he polished lenses, he wrote, 20 years, 2 rooms, 3 cities, a life of productive silence, and a freedom he chose every morning, not out of lack of options, but because he understood it was the only way to be entirely who he was. He died at 44 with his lungs destroyed by glass dust, and with the manuscript on the table. He asked for it to be published without his name. The world discovered the name anyway. What Baruch Spinoza left is not an answer. It is a method, a way of looking at the oldest questions that exist about God, about the mind, about freedom, about death, without retreating, without wrapping the conclusion in sacred language when the conclusion is inconvenient, without stopping at the edge of the abyss and calling the abyss a divine mystery to avoid having to descend. He descended, and what he found down there was not emptiness. It was the same thing that was above. It was the same thing that was everywhere. It was the unique, infinite, eternal substance that exists necessarily and expresses itself in everything. In stone and in thought, in the vacuum of space, and in the emotion you felt just now while listening to this story. God, sive natura, God or nature, not two things. 1. What does this mean for you? It depends on where you arrived here. If you arrived as a believer in a specific religion, Spinoza does not ask you to abandon the experience of sacredness that this religion gave you. He only asks that you examine the difference between genuine sacredness, the awe, the love, the feeling of belonging to something greater, and the historical apparatus that has built up around this sacredness and that sometimes suffocates it. If you arrived as an atheist or agnostic, Spinoza does not invite you back to any God you rejected. He invites you to realize that the word God can name something different from what it has been used to name, that the universe described by science, with its extraordinary mathematical order, its structural beauty, its coherence that goes from the subatomic to the cosmological, is exactly the God of Spinoza. And that being amazed by this is not weakness or superstition. It is the most rational response possible to the scale of what exists. If you arrived not quite knowing what you believe, if you are the kind of person for whom the question lingers, but who has never found a sufficiently honest language to hold it, Spinoza offers you that. A language, a method, a way of thinking about the most important things without lying to yourself. There is something that Einstein said in a 1930 interview that is perhaps the best summary of everything we have tried to do here. He said that the deepest experience a human being can have is not certainty, not faith, not the comfort of an answer that resolves everything. It is what he called cosmic humility, the perception, which comes when you really think about the scale of the universe and your place in it, that you are at once infinitely small and infinitely part of something that has no limit. It is not an experience of annihilation. It is an experience of belonging. You are not a stranger lost in an indifferent universe. It is the universe perceiving itself through you. For now, in this configuration, in this moment. And this, Spinoza said, Einstein said, those who have reached the end and looked honestly say, this is enough, more than enough. It is everything.